So if we were to make a list of the 10 most significant events to ever happen in the gaming industry, the 1983 crash would probably be very high on that list. Not only because of the negatives that obviously occurred as a result of the crash, it was the lowest point in the 50-plus year history of the gaming industry, but also we can't forget the positives. Let's not forget that the gaming crash was responsible for the rise of Nintendo. Remember that the NES was the console that helped end the gaming recession and lead the industry to even greater heights. So moving on to 2017, the state of the industry now. Some people like to find similarities between gaming in 1983 and the industry now to try to say that, oh, there's going to be another gaming crash. Another gaming crash is on the horizon. Be prepared. But before we make the case on whether or not that the gaming crash is inevitable, the second gaming crash is coming, we need to first determine if there's any validity to that argument that there are many similarities between gaming back in 1983 that led to the crash and gaming today. We first need to get that out of the way before we go any further. So let's first take a trip back to 1983 and see what gaming was like back then. Or I guess a better way of putting it is, what were the factors that led to the 1983 crash? Well, if you ask any gaming historian, they would tell you that there were two main factors that led to the 1983 crash. The first being oversaturation. In the early 80s, there were just a shit ton of consoles back then that were being released that you just couldn't keep track of. There were just so many of them. And I actually have a list in front of me of all the consoles that were released at the time. This would be the second generation of consoles. Okay, so here we go. We got the Atari 2600, which everybody knows about. The Bally Astrocade. The RCA Studio 2, Fairchild Channel F2, the VC 4000, Magnavox Odyssey 2, Intellivision, VTech Creativision, Epoch Cassette Vision, Arcadia 2001, Atari 5200, ColecoVision, and Vectrex. So how many is that? That's 13 consoles. 13 home consoles were released in the same generation. And I'm sure to some people that's completely unbelievable because over the past 20 years, there have been, maybe 3, 4 at most? So oversaturation was definitely one factor that contributed to the crash in 1983, without a doubt. So the other main factor that led to the crash was lack of innovation. If you have family members that grew up during this time and played Atari, they would tell you that gaming was very, very, very simple back then. Whenever I play video games and my parents watch me play them, they're like fucking amazed. They're like, oh my god, like that's a video game? It looks so real. Yeah, of course it looks so real to them because back then video games were just a few pixels on a screen. While the 2600 was innovative at the time that it was released, it eventually ran its course. So lack of innovation was definitely a big factor that contributed to the crash because there was not much innovation. As soon as the 2600 came out, yeah, it was very innovative, but after a while, it kind of ran its course. And that eventually led Atari to create the 5200, which was supposed to be a more powerful version of the 2600. So it was pretty much the PS4 Pro of the second generation. It wasn't a next generation console. It was kind of like an in-between console between I guess the second and the third. So I guess it was the in-between console between the 2600 and the 7800. But here's the kicker, though. So the 5200 was a more powerful version of the 2600, right? But it was a fucking train wreck of a console. So let me explain the way that the 5200 worked, okay? So its main purpose of being created, the 5200, was to compete with the Intellivision and the ColecoVision, which at the time were, they were gaining some traction and they were known for having better graphical capabilities than the 2600. Similar to what Microsoft and Sony are doing, trying to make more powerful versions of the PS4 and the Xbox One to, I guess, be more competitive with PC gaming. That seems to be what they're trying to go at. But imagine if while doing this, Sony decided, okay, we're coming out with the PS4 Pro, or Microsoft was like, oh yeah, we're coming out with the Xbox One X, It's the Xbox One, but it's a more powerful version that's more capable of running games, and it's an Xbox One, but it's a lot more powerful than the original one. So this is pretty much what Atari was going for, except they decided, okay, we're going to not have the 5200 to be completely backwards compatible to 2600. So imagine if Microsoft was like, okay, this is a new Xbox One, or if someone was like, this is a new PS4, except it's not backwards compatible with the PS4, even though it's supposed to be a more powerful version of it, because that's pretty much what the 5200 was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a more powerful version of the 2600. As a matter of fact, it had the same exact hardware the same exact internal hardware as the 2600. Its internal hardware was virtually a clone of the 8-bit computer system that the 2600 had. There really weren't too many hardware innovations in the 5200 except for the 4-port controller system that they had. I think it was the first home console that had 4 controller ports. But because of that, it was a pretty new technology back then to have 4 controller ports. That's why the 5200 was fucking humongous, not because it had so much, more advanced graphics or anything. Most of the advancements in technology was just having 2 more controllers, which, at the time was a big deal, but not enough to keep Atari afloat because the 5200 didn't do so well, and it was really the beginning of the end for Atari. Atari stuck around for all these years, and now they're making a new console. I don't know how that's going to turn out. Maybe that's a topic for another day. But yeah, this is pretty much this is pretty much the beginning of the end for Atari, and it's not a coincidence that 1982 was when this console came out, and 1983 was when the video game crash happened. You have to understand, Atari completely dominated the gaming industry back then, and they controlled the majority of the market share for the industry back then. Yeah, you had ColecoVision, and you had the Intellivision, you had all these different consoles. But compared to Atari, they were very, very, very small fish, although they were successful in their own rights, successful enough for Atari to try to compete with them by making a new console. But in hindsight, the 5200 was just such a horrible idea. It was just fucking awful. I don't know what the hell they were thinking. Besides not being backwards compatible with 2600 games, which is a big mistake. The hardware advancements that they were boasting were pretty much non-existent. Actually, so much so that the game that came bundled with the 5200 obviously wasn't any more powerful than any game that's been on the 2600. Why do I say this? Because they released a port of Breakout, which was a very popular arcade game that was released in 1976 before the 2600 even came out. This was their game that was bundled with the 5200. What a way to showcase the 5200's graphical enhancements, right? By showcasing a game that was released on the arcade. This game, by the way, was co-developed by Steve Wozniak. I'm sure you guys have heard of him. He's a pretty big deal. He was only the co-founder of one of the biggest tech companies in the world, a little company called Apple. But yeah, a 6-year-old game was the game that they used to bundle with their new console that was boasting graphical enhancements, like technological innovations. Meanwhile, the only innovation they had, again, like I said, was having 4 controllers, because that was never done before. So that was pretty much the only innovation they had. And even then, the controllers were fucking awful, by the way. I don't know if you know about this, but the 5200 probably has one of the worst controllers ever. So we all know the 2600 had the joystick, and the 5200 had the joystick, but it was less precise. It was much worse in quality than the 2600 joystick, and also had a fucking keyboard thing attached to it. It's a fucking monstrosity. So it was a fucking awful controller design. And that was really one of the only things going for it, is that, you can have four players at once, but no one's going to want to play your shitty fucking console. No one's going to want to have 4 fucking people playing it if your controller sucks. So I don't know what the hell Atari was thinking with the 5200, but it was a complete failure. It only sold 1 million units, and that's pretty bad, because the 2600 sold, how much was it? I think it was like something like 30 million or 20-something million. I think it was like 30 million. It was a pretty big number, especially at the time. Like, I don't even think that some consoles that have been released over the past 20 years haven't even reached that number. I don't think the GameCube even sold that much. I know the Wii U sure as hell didn't. But any way you slice it, when the leading innovator in the gaming industry, which at the time was Atari, releases a very successful console that completely revolutionized the gaming industry, sold 30 million units, was completely, fucking dominating the entertainment industry. And then they release another console that only sells 1 million units, and not even 2 years later, they have to discontinue their console in the midst of the gaming crash. So, lack of innovation, of course, was definitely a big factor. Definitely bigger than the whole oversaturation thing, because let's look at more contemporary examples of oversaturation in the gaming industry. And you will find that there were plenty of generations that came after the second generation that had oversaturation, and we didn't have a fucking gaming crash as a result of it. For example, we had the fifth console generation, which was from the mid-90s to, I'd say, late 90s to early 2000s, whatever. It was pretty much around that time period. That was what the fifth generation was. And it was also oversaturated with consoles. Anybody who grew up in the 90s would attest to that. But in case you don't know about this, they had the Nintendo 64, PS1, which were the two, obviously, most notable examples. And, of course, you also had the Sega Saturn, which was the beginning of the end for Sega. It's probably a story for another day. Then you had the Atari Jaguar, which was the last big home console release that Atari ever made. So that was pretty much the end of Atari, that console. If you thought the 5200 controller was bad, ooh, Atari Jaguar wasn't that much better. You also had the infamous 3DO, which was at a retail price of $700, which in 2017 dollars would be in the ballpark of $1,200. Oh yeah, that's right. It would be worth $1,200 today. That's what their launch price was back then. It was completely absurd. The 3DO was advertised as such a revolutionary product, and that was pretty much their justification for the high price. It wasn't even that much more powerful than the consoles that were already there. As a matter of fact, the PS1 and N64 actually had better graphical capabilities than the 3DO, at least from what I've seen from 3DO games. I looked at the 3DO games, I'm like, really? Like this is worth $700 back then and worth like $1,200 now. You look at the 3DO and it was oh my god, like what made them think that this was a good idea, that people would be willing to pay that much money? So the 3DO, again, that's a story for another day. I might get into the 3DO at a later date because it's a very interesting story. You had three different companies. You had Panasonic, you had Gold Star, and what was the other company that made the 3DO? I can't even think of it. But there was a third company that also made a 3DO. So the 3DO was a whole mess. It's like if you had different companies making PlayStations or something like that. That was just a whole train wreck. But we might get into further detail at a later date if people are interested in me talking about the history of the 3DO, because it was a very interesting, also very infamous home console. But there were even more consoles than that. Those were only the main 5 consoles. There were even more consoles than those 5. There were actually plenty more. Let's look at them. We had the PCFX, and if you don't know what the PCFX was, it was pretty much a successor to the TurboGrafx-16, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. It was a very, very, very popular console in the 4th generation. The problem with the PCFX, the reason why you might have not have heard of it, is because it was one of the consoles. It was one of the very few consoles during that generation that didn't have 3D polygon capabilities. So that was pretty much what the 5th gen was most famous for. It was for 5th gen. 5th gen was well known for its 3D polygon innovation, with these 3D games starting to pop up, because it was really the first generation that had 3D games, unless you want to count the very few cases with the Sega Genesis, like like those bonus levels in the Sonic games. You guys know what I'm talking about. But because the PCFX didn't have those capabilities, it was rendered irrelevant at launch. Nobody gave a fuck about it because 3D graphics was where it was at, and having a console that wasn't capable of having that, it was a very bad idea, and I don't think that company that made the TurboGrafx-16 ever made a console again after that. I'm not too sure, but I'm pretty sure they didn't. Then you also had the Amiga CD32, which was a console released by Commodore. I've honestly never even heard about this before today. I didn't even know that this was a thing. I've heard of the PCFX. I've heard of the 3DO and the Jaguar and whatnot, but I've never heard of this. So that's another console. The FM Towns Marty. What the fuck is an FM Towns Marty? It's another console released in the 5th generation, created by Fujitsu. Huh. The CPS Changer, released by Capcom. Never heard of that one either. The Apple Bandai Pippin, which I have heard of. It was the very infamous console. It was the only console that Apple has ever made. It was a collaboration between Apple and Bandai. It was actually called the Apple Bandai Pippin. And oh my god, that was a whole train wreck. I think that if you try to look for one right now, it's very expensive because it was very rare. Not many were produced, and for a good reason, because it was absolute shit. The Playdia, created by Bandai. And we had the Casio Loopy, created by Casio. So how many consoles would that be? That would be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that's 12 home consoles released. So compare 12 to the 13 that was released in the 2nd generation, which was the era of the video game crash, of course. Which makes me think that oversaturation, while it was a factor, it wasn't the most important one, because if it was, then we would have had a gaming crash during that period as well, during the 4th generation, when consoles, or 5th generation rather, when consoles were being, that was another oversaturated period. You had all these different consoles. So I do think lack of innovation was a bigger factor than oversaturation by a long shot. But with those two factors in mind that contributed greatly to the 1983 crash, are those two factors prevalent right now in the 2017 gaming industry? And I would have to say the answer is unequivocally no. That is not the case in the 2017 industry. Yes, there are plenty of problems that the industry is going through with bad business practices, with a lot of shitty things going on in the industry, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're headed towards another crash. I do not think that's the case at all. Despite all the problems that the industry faces, most notably with game companies trying to nickel and dime you to death with the season passes and the DLCs and the pre-order bonuses and all this other bullshit, you can't really say that there's no innovation in the gaming industry, because over the past 10 years, we've had motion control gaming really being prevalent and becoming mainstream. VR's up and coming right now. It's gaining a lot of traction. So you can't really say there's a lack of innovation. Another point worth making is that back then, again, talking about how simplistic games were back then in the 2600 days, there really wasn't room for having too many different distinct genres in the gaming industry. Right now we have first-person shooters, we have platformers, we have action-adventure games, we have RPGs, we have all these different games, sports games and whatnot. Back then, there really, because of the technological limits, you couldn't have that much variety, that much diversity in the industry that we have today. So that's another reason why I think that we're not headed towards a crash. And also keep in mind, back in '83, the video game industry was at its infancy. Remember, it's the 2nd generation of consoles where the gaming crash occurred. So it's not surprising that there was so much incompetency, so much bad business decisions that were made, because there wasn't really enough years in the industry for there to really be enough experience for people to realize what to do and what not to do. So that's another thing to consider. I just think it would be very hard for there to be another crash. It would be borderline impossible. I wouldn't say impossible, really, because anything can fucking happen. But with the industry continually growing, and it's been growing and growing and growing since the NES, it hasn't really stopped. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, like my erection right now. No, just kidding. But seriously, it would be very hard for the industry to just crash all of a sudden. I just do not think it's happening. The numbers do not show that that's going to happen. Because even if, hypothetically, consoles died, the rest of gaming is still very big. You have PCs, you have mobile, you have all this other shit that's not necessarily in the realm of console gaming, but make up a very large, significant portion of the gaming industry's market share. I think PC gaming is technically number one if you include, Steam, and if you include regular PC games. If you include those games, you include the free-to-play MMOs, and you also include web browser games. You include all that revenue, you mix it up together, and that's considered PC gaming's revenue. So, but it's not console gaming. So if consoles were to hypothetically, be on the decline, which I don't think they are anyway, but people are saying that, oh, consoles are dying, which, again, I'm not really too convinced of, but even if that were the case, gaming would be fine. I don't think that there's going to be a gaming crash. If consoles were to die, would there be a decline in the industry? Sure. Would a lot of people lose their jobs? Absolutely. But would there be a crash to the level of the 1983 one or greater? No, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it can happen with today's technology and with today's innovations and with the industry continually growing over the past 3 decades now. I just don't see it happening. The only situation I could see a crash equal to the 1983 one is if, I guess, if the PS3 was still the only console that we can have. There was no innovation at all. We'd still be stuck with the PS3. No PS4, no Xbox One, nothing like that. We'd still be stuck with our PS3 and 360s. No PC gaming. PC gaming would have to not exist. And mobile gaming is just mobile gaming. It's just take it or leave it, I guess. And we would also have to have, only 3 gaming genres, and those genres would have to overstay their welcome. So it's just can't happen. It's like if we were stuck with the PS3, that was the only console we'd be allowed to play, and there were only 3 or 4 gaming genres like there were back then. Now we have many, many different genres. Not sure the exact number, but it's a fucking shit ton of genres. You have sports games, shooters, all these different fucking genres that I listed a few minutes ago. You know what I'm talking about. There's shit ton of genres. But when it comes to the video game crash, I think that's all I have to say on that matter. I've been going on it for almost 22 minutes now. I think everything's been said already. There's not going to be another gaming crash. Anybody who thinks that, I wouldn't say that they're stupid. That's not really an appropriate thing to say. But they're just not. I just don't think they're well informed on the state of the industry now compared to the state of the industry back then. Because yes, while there's some similarities, there aren't enough to, constitute another gaming crash. It's just absurd to think that way. But that's just what I think. I could be wrong. There could be another gaming crash next year for all I know. I don't know. I seriously doubt that. But I'm just saying. I don't think that another gaming crash is happening. It just seems way too out there for that to be a real possibility. I just don't see it happening.